It is very important that fairy tales are treated with respect. A nation devoid of imagination, romance, has never held, cannot, and will not hold a worthy place under the sun. Charles Dickens, Fraud with Fairies, October 1, 1853. There are no great men, there are only great challenges that ordinary people like you and me are forced to face due to circumstances. U.S. Admiral Bull Halsey, Congressional Report, December 11, 1971. If you have good observational skills, you will be able to understand how these quotes, separated by more than 100 years, relate to this story, and perhaps to something else as well. On a fateful Friday, Charles Kane entered the Ruster bar with a grim expression. In his 29 years, he had never once gotten drunk, but it seemed that tonight would be different. He wanted to forget his wife, with whom he had spent 6 years, Sugar Kane Kowalczyk, known in business as Melissa Kowalczyk, although her real name since she married Charles had been Melissa Kane Kowalczyk, but to all her friends, she was known only as Sugar. More precisely, Charles wanted to forget, at least until he faced her again later face to face. That Sugar was probably doing at that very moment when he entered the Ruster bar. His first beer, not only of the evening but also in 6 or 7 years, tasted as bitter as he remembered it. He wondered how he could get drunk drinking this horse urine, considering how difficult it was to swallow it if it touched his taste receptors. Maybe I should switch to something stronger, he thought to himself, but quickly dismissed the idea since he needed to prolong his revelry to help forget what Sugar had planned. As he finished his second pint of beer at the bar, his discomfort persisted. He noticed a table for two had become available and, shuffling his feet, approached it to be more inconspicuous because, although he needed the noise of human activity, he did not want human interaction, fearing to spoil someone's day with his gloominess. Then he saw her, Norma Desmond. What the hell, why is the wife of wealthy lawyer Joe Desmond, one of my old acquaintances, working as a waitress in the bar? He asked himself. However, it wasn't this question that troubled him the most upon meeting Norma. He was troubled because Norma had been his secret crush since he met her about 5 years ago. For reasons he couldn't adequately explain, she was the woman of his dreams. The only woman besides Sugar who not only rang his bells but also played Flight of the Bumblebee on them. Despite his usual eloquence, Charles always seemed tongue-tied in her presence, and she seemed to enjoy it. By profession, Charles was a psychologist, having earned a master's degree in psychology from the University of Southern California. His specialty was body language, which he had studied through observation since elementary school, long before he began studying it academically. He was one of the few true experts in the country on all aspects of body language, including kinesics, facial expressions and gestures, oculesics, eye movements, tactility, touch, and proxemics, spatial relationships. Among his grateful clients were law enforcement agencies, government negotiators, major corporations, and private individuals with personal relationship issues. He had a policy of not using his professional expertise in public situations or in his personal relationships, and he only broke this policy with regards to his wife Sugar and Norma. It was easy to read Sugar's words, and that was the source of his dissatisfaction this night at the Ruster bar. On the other hand, Norma was one of about half a dozen people since he started his psychological practice whose body language he couldn't read correctly. For example, she was the only person whose eyes wrinkled regardless of whether she smiled genuinely or pretended. This created an atmosphere of mystery around her and probably intensified his attraction to her. Charles gathered himself as Norma approached his table. "Hey, Killer Kane," she said with a smile. This was her playful nickname for him, giving him a hug. "What brings you to Ruster?" Not wanting to disclose the reason for his presence here, Charles overcame his usual lack of eloquence in Norma's presence and asked her in return. What's even more important is what a wealthy woman is doing waiting tables in a bar. Norma laughed. "My brother Rick Blaine owns this wonderful establishment. I worked here during college to earn money for expenses. Tonight he was short 2 waitresses due to illness, and Joe left town for a court case, so I offered to help. My biological family is important to me," she chuckled. "Oh wow, what a great sister. If you don't mind, could you bring me some onion rings? I promise a big tip," Charles replied with his own chuckle. "Only if you promise not to kiss me with your onion breath," Norma giggled, pinching his cheek before walking away. "Damn, that guy has his own opinion of her," Charles muttered to himself, trying to suppress the instant excitement. Charles's mood improved slightly only after a brief conversation with the woman he had dreamed about. This made him think about how different the only two women he truly desired in his adult life were externally. Sugar was a tall, full-chested blonde, while Norma was a petite brunette, whose cup size could have been the highest mark on a middle school exam. However, they both had large, for their size, round buttocks and practically perfect hips and thighs. He knew why he felt desire, at least until recently, for Sugar, but wasn't sure why he felt desire for Norma. Maybe it was the curve of her back, the way she quickly tossed her hair from her face, the strength of her almost black irises, or her pheromones. Most likely, it was a combination of all these things. He also briefly thought about their different personalities. Sugar was flirtatious and fickle. Norma was slightly sultry and straightforward. With his mood slightly improved, primarily due to the opportunity to watch Norma sway her beautiful backside around the establishment and her frequent visits to his table for friendly chats, Charles decided not to drink too much. Although he continued to order beer from his all-time favorite waitress, most of the drink was poured into boxes with live plants scattered around the bar. Luckily, he was not drunk but alert when, after spending about an hour and a half there, a tan guy in a hoodie entered the bar. Just as Norma brought him another pint, Charles stood up from his chair just before Norma arrived and, trying not to stare at the new customer, whispered to Norma, "This is not a joke. Based on his body language and appearance, I understand that the guy in the hoodie, don't look right away, is most likely a suicide bomber. When I go after him, clear everyone at least 20 meters away from the entrance and call 911 for the police and ambulance." Norma's smile quickly turned into displeasure. Charles didn't need to be an expert in body language to notice the surprise, worry, and horror on her face. "Do it," he muttered, squeezing her elbow. Charles was a big, strong, and fast guy. As a senior student, he was a player on Duke's second team for All-American Lacrosse in the national championship. Moving at the speed of a midfielder, he shifted behind the guy in the hoodie and grabbed his right hand with both hands. Charles quickly confirmed that he was right, believing that the device located to the right of the hoodie was the suicide bomber's trigger, so he needed to keep it in his hands because if he let go, the bomb in the vest would explode. As soon as the guy in the hoodie fell to the floor, with Charles on top of him, Norma shouted again and again, "Bomber, bomber, get the hell out of here." At first, the noise in the bar just subsided. Within a few seconds, when they saw Charles lying on the floor, a mass exodus began. Norma ran to her brother Rick Blaine and yelled, "Call the police, bomb squad, and ambulance." The bar was cleared in less than 2 minutes. Norma went outside and shouted to the crowd gathered at the entrance, "Move back 20 meters. If there's an explosion, you'll be in danger here." Norma bravely rushed back to check on Charles's condition while he kept the guy under control. The guy was desperately resisting and seemed almost as big and strong as Charles. Even a momentary loosening of Charles's grip could lead to his death and the destruction of the bar. "Norma, when the paramedics arrive, have them administer a sedative to this guy, and let the bomb squad in as soon as they arrive," Charles instructed. "Got it," Norma replied. "Now get the hell out of here and don't come back," Charles growled. Though only a few minutes had likely passed, Charles and Norma felt like hours had gone by before the paramedics and the first wave of police arrived. When Norma told the paramedics that Charles needed attention, they took out a syringe from their kit but said, "We can't do anything until the bomb squad arrives. By then it might be too late. My friend won't be able to hold this guy off for long," Norma yelled. "Sorry, ma'am, we can't do that," said the male paramedic. While Rick tried to talk to the paramedic to persuade him to help Charles, Norma snatched the syringe from the paramedic's hand, dodged the police officer trying to stop her, and ran back to the Ruster bar. "Where should I inject him?" she asked Charles in desperation, who was sweating profusely but still maintained composure. "Pull down his hoodie and check if there's an exposed blood vessel on his neck, then inject there," Charles replied, panting, without bothering to ask why Norma had the syringe instead of the paramedic. Norma did as instructed. She saw a large, easily accessible blood vessel and emptied the syringe into it. "Kneel on his head for a minute or so," Charles exhaled when the suicide bomber jerked. Norma complied once again. Approximately 60 seconds later, the terrorist stopped moving. "Now go out and bring the bomb squad as soon as they arrive," ordered Charles. Norma obeyed once more. About 10 minutes later, the bomb squad arrived. 2 police officers in suits entered the bar. Charles quickly briefed them on the situation. They confirmed that it was a suicide bomber who still held the trigger in his right hand, which Charles was gripping with both hands. After a minute or two of observation, they cut several wires and then told Charles, "You can release now." Charles's hands were cramped, and his entire body was drenched in sweat, but otherwise, he felt fine. The relief of being alive might contribute to this, along with such a serious distraction that he didn't have time to think about his stubborn, deceitful wife. When the bomb squad reported that everything was clear, a dozen police officers burst in, arresting the still unconscious terrorist. They removed his vest and placed him in a container for disarming explosive devices. They then offered Charles, whose knees were shaking slightly, help to get out of the bar. As he emerged, joyful cheers erupted from the crowd. Norma, bypassing the crime scene barriers, ran up to Charles and threw herself into the arms of her 100-pound friend. Thankfully without knocking him down, covering his sweaty face, lips and neck with kisses. A smiling policewoman gently scolded them, found a room, separated them, and led them to a patrol car at the scene. As they walked to the patrol car, a tall man in a rumpled suit stood in front of Norma and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I have to arrest you for the unlawful use of prohibited substances." Charles's mood suddenly shifted from joyous to grim. He stepped in front of the man in the suit and stared angrily into his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" "Detective Harold Callahan," growled the man in the suit, showing his badge. "Well, Harold," Charles growled back, "this woman saved my life and prevented the destruction of the entire building housing the bar, if not the surrounding buildings. So the only way you're arresting her is over my dead or unconscious body. Let's see how that affects your career and the image of the police department." Shortly before Charles and Callahan clashed, Captain Jerome McKee intervened. "It's okay, Harry," he said to Callahan. "No one besides the terrorist will be arrested." Callahan didn't like that his objections were dismissed, but he backed down. The police brought Norma and Charles to the headquarters in a patrol car, and then questioned them separately for over an hour. District Attorney Jack McCoy was present during Charles's interrogation, while Assistant District Attorney Alexandra Borgia handled Norma's questioning. After they had been there for just about 20 minutes, lawyers arrived, hired by Norma's brother Rick Blaine. Charles declined legal representation. "I'm just a witness," he smiled at one lawyer, while Norma allowed another lawyer to be present only to reassure her brother. Norma and Charles were informed that the explosive vest worn by the terrorist contained enough PE4, a British equivalent of C-4, to kill everyone in the bar and collapse the entire building. Once Norma and Charles finished their interrogations, Rick, patiently waiting for them in the police station lobby, drove them back to their cars. As Rick bid them farewell, tears welled in his eyes as he hugged his younger sister, undoubtedly the bravest member of the family. Tears still in his eyes, he turned to Charles, choking up, "Dude, if you ever need anything, if it's within my power, just ask, and it's done." "All right, settle my beer and onion rings tab tonight," Charles grinned. Rick laughed through tears. "This is just the beginning," he said. After Rick left, Norma turned to Charles and seductively placed her hand on his bare chest just below his neck. Charles didn't need to be an expert in body language to understand what Norma meant. "You know, Killer Kane, I'm really tired. But I think fatigue is a great aphrodisiac. Let's go to my place," she said in the most passionate voice Charles had ever heard. "What about Joe?" Charles asked, trying to suppress his arousal. "He didn't save my life and the lives of countless others," she chuckled. "And what about Sugar?" he asked. "She not only didn't save your life, but you were at the bar to forget that she cheated on you." "So, what about her?" Norma chuckled again. Charles began to ask, "Why are you saying that?" But all that came out was, "Why?" before she pressed her index finger to his lips. "Because your little friend enthusiastically greets me every time he sees me. Are you really going to deny me?" She chuckled again. 15 minutes later, they were showering together in Norma's guest bathroom. More squeezing and exchanging saliva than washing up. In the end, the two lovers took a break, crawled under the covers, and then, with newfound enthusiasm and passion they had never experienced before, made love again. When the sun rays penetrated Norma's guest bedroom, which faced the east, Charles finally stirred. Norma was lying on his shoulder, likely since they had made love. His movement caused her to open her eyes. She smiled at him and remarked, "I suppose my appearance may seem intimidating, as if I've spent the whole night in passionate turmoil," and then burst into laughter. After some playful banter, Charles said seriously, "You're incomparable, Norma. Truly incomparable. I've never had anything better in my life since we ended up in your bed and until today." Is there any way to get rid of Sugar and steal you from Joe? It's your personal matter to let go of Sugar. As for stealing me from Joe, I don't think he'll be upset if I leave him. He's so consumed with himself and his career that we haven't even hugged, let alone had sex in at least a month. I really needed you last night, and if what we have in the future is even a quarter of what it was last night, we'll leave him and end up in your bed as fast as humanly possible. Killer, she sighed. Don't you worry that we're both cheaters? Charles frowned, asking. What we did last night was just a thank you to each other for saving each other's lives. We're not going to sleep again until we both tell our spouses that we're leaving them. So, if you want me instead of Sugar, Norma replied with a smile. Charles smiled. Do you think we can consider this morning just a continuation of our thanks? He devilishly inquired. I think so, Norma murmured, kissing Charles. Charles arrived home around 11 a.m. on Saturday. On the way from Norma's house, his thoughts were clouded with many things. As he reflected on it, he was still shaken by the almost catastrophe at the bar, but, for understandable reasons, he was proud of how he handled the situation. However, in reality, he didn't dwell too much on it because his thoughts were occupied by what an amazing woman of his dreams Norma Desmond was and how she sexually satisfied him in a way he never suspected was possible. These pleasant thoughts were occasionally interrupted by the impending clash with his dear wife, Sugar Cane Kowalczyk. As Charles approached his home, he saw Sugar peeking out from the living room window. Just then, his mobile phone rang, displaying the area code 212 and the message, "Today's Show." Intrigued, he answered with a simple, "Hello. Hello. Is this Charles Kane?" A melodic female voice came from the other end of the line. "Yes. Who is this?" Charles replied. "This is Lizzie Borden, executive producer of Today's Show in New York," came the joyful response. "How did you get my mobile number, Lizzie?" "Of course, from Rick Blaine. By the way, he really likes you." Charles didn't recall giving Rick his mobile number, but, of course, he was with Norma, and she could have given it to him. "So, why did you call, Lizzie?" "I think you can guess. We like to have real American heroes on Today's Show, and we would be thrilled to have you early next week. Our standard procedure covers all travel and accommodation expenses for 1 or 2 nights. For us, Charles, Tuesday or Wednesday would work best." "I'm not sure, Lizzie. I'm not sure I want exposure or hero worship." Charles began to reply, but then turned his head to see what the loud noise behind him was and noticed that 2 news vans had pulled up to his house, one with CNN on the side and the other with ABC, both with satellite dishes on top. Hold on a second, Lizzie, I need to go inside. A couple of news vans just arrived. Is your correct number listed in my caller ID? I'll call you back. Yes, this is the best number to reach me. Please call me back. I don't want to bother you, but I will chase you down if you don't get in touch with me, Lizzie chuckled. I'll call within 2 hours, I promise, Charles replied before ending the call and hurrying into the house. Sugar, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, sharply asked Charles, "Where have you been?" And Charles replied, "Where have you been? Obviously, you haven't listened to the news or read today's paper, have you, darling?" Charles added, saying, "darling," with a fair bit of sarcasm. Sugar looked puzzled. "Look at the 2 news vans outside the house. They're interested in what I was doing last night too," Charles growled. "Maybe you can tell them about how you were fooling around with Norman Bates while I'll talk about the incident at the Ruster bar?" Sugar's face drained of color. I don't understand what you're talking about," she defensively replied. "Darling, have you forgotten what my profession entails? I don't usually rely on my expertise in reading body language to assess personal relationships, but our conversation yesterday at noon, before you went to work, gave me a clear idea of what you would be up to last night." "I still don't understand what the hell you're talking about," protested Sugar, stomping her foot on the floor and blushing even more. "Well, let's see," sarcastically replied Charles, stroking his chin deliberately. "When I talked to you about why you wouldn't be home until midnight and what you'd be doing, your body language indicated you were lying. Remember how vague you were, avoiding details, when I asked you where you would be and with whom?" He asked rhetorically. Sugar's eyes widened. "Do you remember how you repeated my questions before answering them? Do you remember how you spoke in fragments of sentences? Do you remember that you didn't provide specific details when I refuted your story about Norman Bates not being there and how you played with your hair while talking to me?" Charles continued. "These are all classic signs of deception. Sugar, darling, and yours were the most blatant I've ever seen. However, it wasn't surprising, as over the past 6 months, you've been lying to me more and more. With each rhetorical question, Sugar's eyes grew wider. She opened her mouth but said nothing. Don't even try to answer, darling. While you were having sex with Norman Bates, I was just trying to prevent a suicide bomber from blowing up the Ruster bar. The place where I went to drown my sorrows over having such a cheating bitch of a wife. Charles cut in. There was a knock on the door. Charles turned away from Sugar, who still sat with her mouth agape, and opened the door. Before CNN and ABC reporters could speak, he raised his hand and said, "I won't be making any statements to the press for now. I'm still in shock from what happened last night and my mind is clouded. Of course, most of what you need can be found in the police reports. But, Mr. Kane," protested CNN reporter Dexter Morgan, "the public wants to hear your side. They're dying for information. I'll make a statement with Miss Desmond tomorrow. If you give me your business cards, I promise I'll call," Charles replied. Morgan handed over his business card, as did ABC reporter Albert DeSalvo. "Thank you, and now please leave. I need to console my distraught wife," Charles said, laughing and closing the door. On the second floor, Sugar was nowhere to be seen. Charles rushed into the master bedroom and saw Sugar sitting on the bed with tears in her eyes. Charles Kane got straight to the point. "It's over between us, Sugar. When I come back from filming today's show next week, I want you gone." But Sugar began to protest. "But nothing." Charles shouted, "We're done, period. And tell your little friend Norman Bates that his time is up. I would never inflict physical pain on a woman, but he's about to experience real physical pain, much greater than what I dealt to the suicide bomber in the Ruster bar." Sugar's sobs created a background noise as Charles staggered to the backyard to call Norma. "Hello, Norma, and no, I'm not going to indulge your ego anymore with tales of how you're a sex goddess," Charles chuckled. "Bring them pleasure and leave them yearning for more, killer," Norma smirked in response. "Something like that. Anyway, my call has two purposes. Firstly, I told Sugar that it's over between us, and that's how it is. Secondly, we're invited to the Today Show on Tuesday or Wednesday morning. Do you want to go? We could spend a couple of evenings together playing Hide the Salami at a New York hotel if you break up with Joe by then." "Wow," Norma laughed. "I'll call Joe tonight. And yes, I'd love to go to the Today Show. Wednesday morning would be best for me." "Okay, unless I call you back to say something else. Plan to spend Tuesday and Wednesday evenings at the hotel so we can find all our erogenous zones," Charles smirked. "That might take more than 2 nights, buddy," Norma giggled. "Oh, and one more thing. I promise that tomorrow we'll make a joint statement for CNN and ABC." Charles immediately called Lizzie Borden back. "All right, Lizzie, here's the deal, agree or not. Norma Desmond, who played no less a role in saving Ruster Bar and its patrons than I did, and I will attend the preliminary interview on Tuesday afternoon and participate in the show on Wednesday morning. We're entering into a comprehensive agreement. In addition to our expenses, by the way, we only need 1 hotel room. You'll make a donation of $25,000 to international charity of our choice. We don't usually do this." Lizzie began to protest. "What you usually do is not important to me, Lizzie. If you really want this story, first I'll have a detailed conversation with CNN and ABC, who are already knocking at my door. You do this, or I'll talk to them instead of you. Call me back within an hour and let me know if we're in agreement," Charles concluded. "Wait, that's not necessary," Lizzie replied. "Okay, we're in agreement. Send me an email confirming the deal." "My email address," Charles began to say. "We already have it," Lizzie chuckled. "It'll be there within an hour, along with detailed flight and hotel information for you and Mrs. Desmond." Norma and Charles's joint statement for CNN, ABC, CBS, and Al Jazeera, made the next day, was brief and pleasant, with each of them answering only one question. Norma called Joe on Saturday afternoon. "Sorry to interrupt your trial preparation, Joe, but something happened. Maybe you saw it in the news." "You know, I'm too busy to keep up with the news," Joe snapped. "Yeah, I figured as much. I don't want to bother you, but Charles Kane and I saved my brother's bar and about 60 people's lives from a suicide bomber." "What the hell? Are you kidding? What are you talking about, Norma? Open your browser and search for Ruster Bar and suicide bomber and you'll see. By the way, I'm leaving you for Charles Kane." "What the hell? Are you trying to distract me from focusing on the trial? You haven't had time or interest in me for a long time." "Charles does. Since we don't want to cheat, he suggested sugar, and I'm advising you that it's over between us both. Tomorrow, I intend to immerse him in such a sea of passion that he will lose consciousness. No, you can't do this. Joe began to say. I just did. When you come back to town in 10 days, I won't be home anymore. I hope your trial process goes well, and with that, Norma hung up the phone. Her mobile didn't respond when the caller ID displayed, Joe. The interview that Norma and Charles gave on Today's Show on Wednesday went very well for them. Almost as well as the party at the Plaza Hotel on Tuesday evening. Both Charles and Norma considered each other real heroes and were as modest as possible but without pretense. Charles did share some of his professional observations as a body language expert, but refused to disclose the most important body language clue that led him to notice the suicide bomber hoodie, so that another suicide bomber wouldn't practice it in the future. After the interview, Charles and Norma had a fun day in New York, including a quick dinner and a Broadway show. That night, as they lay on the king-size bed in the hotel in post-coital bliss, with Charles gently pinching and massaging Norma asked, "Where are we going to move in together when we get back?" Charles smiled. "Don't you think that's too hasty?" "Damn, no," Norma chuckled. "I realized what kind of person you are from your actions last week." Although disarming the suicide bomber was very impressive, what was even more impressive was your advocacy for me in front of Detective Harry Callahan. Your firm belief in my equal participation in every discussion and interview concerning the matter, and the notable fact that since the night of the incident, I've experienced the 7 most fulfilling encounters and 2 most memorable moments of intimacy in my life. I want to get used to that treatment. Charles smiled. "Aren't you interested in living together?" Norma asked with a mischievous smile. "Actually, only my restrained passion for you could sustain me in blissful coexistence with you for the next 25 years. Not to mention my love for you, which grows exponentially every day. We know each other and I've desired you for 5 years, so I know who you are, and your actions on the night of the incident only heightened my admiration for you. In fact, I intend to propose to you the moment our 2 divorces become final." Charles smiled. With a serious tone, Norma replied, "Here's what I'll tell you. Why don't you make the proposal now, anticipating that a second after our divorces are final, and see what the answer will be." "All right," sighed Charles. Taking a deep breath, he asked, "Norma, will you make me the happiest man in the world by marrying me a second after we divorce?" Norma replied, stroking her chin. "Let me give you a nonverbal answer, Killer Kane. You're an expert in body language. Let's see if you can understand my answer from this." With those words, Norma lay down on the bed and began to fondle Charles.